Make sure to like the video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe so you never miss a new story. The house had finally fallen silent. Upstairs, the soft creak of floorboards had stilled as the kids drifted into sleep, and the comforting hum of the dishwasher filled the kitchen with its steady rhythm. It was the kind of quiet that felt earned, the kind that made a cup of chamomile tea taste warmer, more deserved. I had just curled up in my usual spot at the kitchen counter, the glow of my laptop screen lighting my face in the otherwise dim room. I wasn't planning to do anything serious. Maybe clear a few work emails, scroll through a sale. I wasn't actually going to buy anything from. A little digital white noise to end the day. But then I saw it. From Jonathan Pierce. Subject: I've been holding this in for too long. My hand hovered above the touchpad, fingers frozen mid-click. Jonathan. It felt like the name itself carried weight. A familiar heaviness I hadn't thought about in years. I hadn't seen it in my inbox, or frankly in my life, in more than 6 years. We had parted ways professionally after he left the firm. No goodbye lunch. No parting words. Just a forwarded email about his departure and a few awkward looks in the hallway in the days before he disappeared from my everyday life. And now this? I clicked. The email opened with no greeting. Just a deep breath written in silence. And then, line by line, words that I never expected. I know this might feel out of nowhere, and maybe I don't deserve to be writing this at all. But I've been thinking about you. About us. If there ever was an US. About what I never said, and what I always wanted to. My breath caught. I blinked, leaned back in the chair slightly, as if distance from the screen might somehow soften the intensity of the message. We spent a lot of time together. Probably more than we should have. I told myself it was work. Projects. Deadlines. Late nights at the office. But it wasn't just that. Not really. I felt my pulse quicken. My tea was cooling beside me untouched. I never said anything back then. I didn't know how. Maybe I still don't. But every time I walked past your desk and you looked up at me, I felt it. That pull. Like maybe we both knew, and we were just too afraid to say it out loud. I scrolled down, heart hammering now. I'm not asking for anything.
You don't owe me a reply.
I just needed you to know that I never forgot. And that some connections don't fade, even when the world expects them to. It ended there. No sign-off. No name. Just blank space. Like the rest of what he wanted to say had been erased at the last second. I stared at the screen. The hum of the dishwasher was suddenly deafening. I didn't sleep that night. I tried. I turned off my laptop, brushed my teeth, climbed into bed beside my husband, who was already dozing, his soft breathing steady and unaware of the storm quietly unraveling beside him. But every time I closed my eyes, all I could see was the email. His words, carefully chosen, maybe rewritten a dozen times before he hit send. Or maybe they came out in one raw burst. Either way, they had landed exactly where he wanted them to, somewhere deep inside me that I hadn't visited in years. The next morning was routine on the outside.
Coffee.
Breakfast. The kids arguing over who took the last clean spoon. My husband asking if I'd seen his keys again. But inside, I was anything but routine. The email replayed over and over in my mind. Not just the words, but the timing. Why now? What had made Jonathan reach out after all these years? By noon, I couldn't take the silence anymore. I opened my laptop again, fingers hovering above the keyboard.
I didn't know what I was going to say.
Part of me wanted to ignore the whole thing. Pretend it hadn't shaken me. That it hadn't made something inside me flutter and ache all at once. But another part of me, quiet, insistent, dangerous, wanted to know more. I started typing. Subject: I've been holding this in for too long. Hi, Jonathan. I wasn't expecting your message. To be honest, I'm still trying to understand how I feel about it. It brought back a lot of memories. Some I didn't realize were still there. I'm not sure what made you write after all this time, but I'm listening.
L.
I hit send before I could overthink it, and immediately regretted it. I closed the laptop and went for a walk. No destination, just motion.
Air. Trees.
I needed to feel normal again, but I didn't. Not after that message. Not after how fast my fingers had typed a reply. When I returned home an hour later, my phone buzzed with a new email. He had replied. Subject: Thank you for replying. Lena, I didn't think you would write back. I told myself you wouldn't, but I hoped you might. I've been carrying this for years. And every time I almost moved on, I'd think about you. About the way you looked at me when you disagreed during meetings. How your voice would soften when you were trying to save someone else from embarrassment. How, somehow, you always knew when I needed someone to notice, but never asked for it. I don't know what I expected by telling you. I just knew I couldn't keep it in any longer. You don't have to say anything else. I just wanted to be honest, finally.
J.
I reread the message slowly. And then again. Because there was something about the way he wrote that made it impossible to look away. It wasn't just a man reminiscing. It wasn't even flirtation. It was intimacy, the kind that lives in the pauses between words, the kind that exists in what isn't said.
And it scared me.
Not because it was wrong, but because part of me wanted to feel it again. By the third day, I stopped pretending that life felt normal. I found myself checking my phone more than usual, opening my inbox just to stare at his last message. I didn't reply.
Not yet.
I told myself I needed time. But time wasn't the problem. Clarity was. It's strange how one message can stir up years of buried emotions like dust in a forgotten attic. Things I'd sealed away neatly, with careful logic and quiet shame. Things I had no intention of revisiting. And yet here I was, revisiting. That night, after the house had gone quiet again, I poured myself a glass of wine and walked into the guest room, my so-called workspace. The desk was cluttered with unopened mail, a dying houseplant, and a framed photo from my time at the agency. The one where Jonathan and I had worked side by side for 5 years. The photo was from a team retreat, one of those awkward corporate bonding events by a lake with too many icebreakers and 4 smiles. But I wasn't looking at myself. I was looking at him. Jonathan stood a few people behind me, one hand in his pocket, the other resting casually on the shoulder of one of the interns. He was smiling, but not at the camera.
At me.
And suddenly it hit me. I had always known. Even then, even in the thick of presentations and deadlines and endless cups of burnt coffee, we had known that there was a line neither of us crossed, but always stood dangerously close to. The conversations that lingered after meetings. The shared looks across the conference table. The small, wordless moments no one else seemed to notice. It had been unspoken, professional, innocent, we told ourselves. But deep down it hadn't been. Not really. Back then I was newly married, eager to prove I could balance a career and a husband and still be all the things I was supposed to be. Jonathan was my boss's boss. Charismatic.
Reserved.
Always respectful. Always one breath away from something unspoken. And I was careful. I thought about that version of myself now, standing beside a man she never touched but somehow always felt. I sat down at the desk, placed the photo face down, and opened my laptop. Subject: still thinking. Jonathan. Asterisk: I've been thinking about your message. About what it means to carry something for years. I remember the late nights. The looks. The things we never said. I told myself we were just 2 people who worked well together. That anything else was just in my head. But I think we both know that's not true. Asterisk. Asterisk: I don't know what to do with all of this. I don't know what you expect from me, or what I'm even capable of giving. But I can't pretend like I didn't feel it too. Asterisk. Lena. I didn't wait. I hit send. And then I sat there in the quiet, staring at the blinking cursor, heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. Not from fear, but from something far more dangerous. Longing. I didn't expect him to reply that night. But he did. It came just past midnight, when the world was asleep, and even my guilt was groggy enough to ignore. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, the screen lighting up the dark room. Jonathan Pierce. Can I call you? I stared at the message, barely breathing. It felt absurd, how quickly my heart could react to 2 simple words. Can I call you? I hesitated. I could say no. I should say no. But I didn't. Me. Now. Jonathan. Only if you want to. I waited 3 seconds. Then typed. Me. Okay. The phone rang 10 seconds later. I slipped out of bed, quietly, carefully, and padded barefoot down the hall to the laundry room because it was the only place in the house where no one could hear me. I sat on the edge of the dryer, knees pulled to my chest, and pressed the phone to my ear. Lena. His voice was low, almost a whisper. And yet it filled the silence so completely that I felt my entire body respond. Hey, I said, barely louder than him. A pause. Long waited. I didn't think you'd respond, he said. Well, I exhaled. You said a lot of things I wasn't ready to hear, but I've been hearing them anyway. Another pause, but not awkward. It was full of the things neither of us quite knew how to say yet. I almost didn't send that email, he admitted. I wrote it 3 months ago. That made me blink. 3 months. I kept saving it as a draft, rewriting, deleting, telling myself I'd moved on, that I should leave the past alone. But I haven't. I couldn't. I pressed my forehead against the cold wall behind me, eyes closed. I don't know what you want from me, Jonathan, I said quietly. I have a life, a husband, kids, a whole world you don't belong to anymore. I know, he said gently, and I'm not here to ruin it. I swear. Then why now? I whispered, a beat of silence. And then, because the longer I stayed silent, the more it felt like I had left something unfinished. And I needed you to know that what we almost had, meant something. Still does. I felt a lump rise in my throat. I'm not the same person I was back then, I said. Neither am I, he replied. But some things don't really change. They just go quiet. His words landed like a soft punch to the chest. I wanted to tell him to stop, that this was dangerous, that this wasn't fair, but all I could say was, you always knew what to say. I only ever wanted to say it to you. Silence again. And then I did something I hadn't expected. I laughed. Soft, broken, a little disbelieving, but real. He laughed too. God, I've missed your laugh. Jonathan, I said, catching my breath. What are we doing? I don't know, he admitted. But I'm not trying to take anything from you. I'm not asking for anything. I just want to talk. No pressure. No expectations. Just space to exist with you again. I didn't know what to say to that. So I said the only thing I could. Okay, I whispered. We'll talk. A quiet exhale from his end. Relief. Good night, Lena. Good night, Jonathan. I ended the call. Sat in the dark laundry room for a long time. My bare feet cold. My thoughts burning. Because what scared me most wasn't that he'd called. It was that I didn't want him to stop. The next morning, I was back to my role. Wife, mother, professional, multitasking magician. Lunches were packed. Teeth were brushed. Shoes were located under couches and behind doors. The kids were their usual chaotic selves, and my husband kissed my cheek on his way out the door, distracted as always by a half-read email and a to-go coffee cup. No one noticed that I hadn't slept, but I did. There was a weight behind my eyes, a tension in my chest, and something else, something I couldn't name, but felt like electricity humming just beneath my skin. A residue, from the voice I hadn't heard in years, that now echoed in my mind like a song I couldn't forget. I powered through work calls, answered emails, and listened to a podcast I couldn't recall a single word from. But every so often, my phone would light up. A message. From him. Jonathan. Hope today's not too heavy. Thinking of you. I never knew how to respond to those. Not really. So, I just liked the message. A small, cowardly acknowledgement that didn't say too much, but didn't say nothing either. Around 4 p.m., as I stood at the kitchen island slicing apples for the kids' snack, my sister called. Hey, I said, balancing the phone between my shoulder and ear. You sound weird, she replied immediately. Are you sick? No. I laughed too quickly. Just tired. There was a pause. One of those sisterly silences that says, don't lie to me. You've been off the last few days, she said slowly. Everything okay at home? I hesitated, my fingers pausing on the cutting board. Yes, I said. Everything's fine. Another pause. Lena, you can tell me if something's wrong. Is it Greg? Is something going on with the kids? No, I said quickly. Nothing like that. I'm just a little overwhelmed, that's all.
She sighed.
You don't sound overwhelmed. You sound like someone who's thinking about something they're not supposed to be thinking about. That made my heart skip. I nearly dropped the knife. I don't know what that means, I said, too calmly. Yes, you do. She didn't press. She didn't have to. My sister had always been better than I liked at reading between my silences. After we hung up, I stared out the window over the sink. The late afternoon sun was low, casting gold across the yard, lighting up the tiny handprints still smeared on the glass. And I asked myself a question I'd been avoiding. What are you doing? Because it wasn't just a call anymore, or an email, or a ghost from the past. It was a growing presence, a thread quietly stitching itself back into the fabric of my days. A secret I was beginning to carry like a second heartbeat. I opened my phone. My fingers hovered. And then, impulsively, I typed.
Me.
What would you say if I asked you not to reach out for a few days? His reply came faster than I expected. Jonathan, I'd say I understand. And I'd still be here if you changed your mind. I stared at that message. Read it twice. And hated how much it hurt to feel seen. To feel respected. To feel safe by someone who wasn't supposed to matter anymore. I didn't reply. But I didn't delete the thread either. And that in itself said everything. It was Friday night. The kind of evening that used to feel like a small reward. Pizza delivery, mismatched pajamas, a movie we never finished because someone always fell asleep halfway through. Our version of peace. But tonight, I felt like a stranger in my own living room. Greg sat beside me on the couch, a cold beer in one hand, scrolling through his phone with the other. The kids had already retreated upstairs, tired from a long week. The TV was on volume low, playing some crime drama neither of us was really watching. I hadn't heard from Jonathan in 4 days. Not since I asked him not to reach out. And even though it had been my request, the silence ached in places I hadn't expected. I told myself it was better this way. That I needed the distance. That I needed to remember who I was. But the truth was I didn't feel like myself at all anymore. You've been quiet lately, Greg said suddenly, not looking up from his phone. My heart paused. Just tired, I replied, too quickly. He looked at me then, finally, setting the phone on the coffee table. His brow furrowed. No, it's not just that. You've been somewhere else. I shrugged. Work's been a lot. You said that last week. And the week before. I stayed silent. Greg leaned in slightly. Lena, talk to me. What's going on? I opened my mouth. And then closed it. Because what could I possibly say? That someone from my past had come back with carefully written sentences and a voice that still lived under my skin? That I had done nothing wrong, and yet everything inside me felt unraveled? Instead, I said the safest thing I could think of. I don't know. I just feel off. He studied me.
Really studied me.
And for a moment, I saw something flicker behind his eyes. Fear? Doubt? You haven't looked at me the same lately, he said, quieter now. That broke something in me. Because he wasn't wrong. I hadn't looked at him the same. I had looked through him, over him, past him, searching for something that didn't belong to him at all. He reached for my hand. Are we okay? My throat tightened. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to lie cleanly and easily and with conviction. But something in me refused. So instead, I whispered, I don't know. Greg froze. The silence between us grew thick, heavy with things we weren't ready to say. He looked down at our hands, his fingers still wrapped around mine, and then pulled away slowly. I didn't realize things had gotten that far, he murmured. I didn't either. I replied, my voice breaking. Because I hadn't. Not until that moment. It wasn't about Jonathan. Not really.
It was about me.
The parts one had forgotten. The parts that only seemed to wake up when someone saw me as something more than what I had become. I stood slowly, wrapping the blanket around my shoulders. I'm going to bed, I said. Greg didn't stop me. He just sat there, staring at the screen, even though the show had ended and the credits had long since faded. Upstairs, in the dark, I lay in bed and did the one thing I had promised myself I wouldn't do. I reached for my phone and opened the thread. Still no message. Still silence. And yet, I didn't close it, because even in his absence he was present. And I hated how much that mattered. The next morning came with the weight of everything unsaid. Greg was already gone when I woke up. No note. No coffee waiting. Just silence. Heavy, intentional silence. I sat in the kitchen, fingers wrapped around a lukewarm mug, staring out the window as rain tapped gently against the glass. The house was still. The kind of stillness that doesn't feel peaceful, just hollow. I hadn't spoken to Jonathan in almost a week. I hadn't written. He hadn't either. It should have felt like closure. Instead, it felt like starvation. The ache wasn't just emotional, it was physical. I missed his voice, the way he saw through the armor I wore around everyone else. I missed the feeling of being awake, of being wanted in a way that wasn't routine or transactional. I picked up my phone, stared at the empty thread. Then, almost without thought, I began to type.
Me.
I need to see you. I hit send before I could stop myself. My heart beat wildly in the quiet kitchen. The seconds ticked by like raindrops sliding down the glass.
1, 2,
3, 5 minutes.
10.
Then, finally, my phone buzzed. Jonathan. Where? I hesitated. My hands were shaking.
Me.
Somewhere no one will recognize me. We met that evening. A cafe across town, quiet and dim, tucked between an old bookstore and a flower shop that had long since closed for the day. The kind of place where no one asked questions. When I walked in, he was already there, sitting near the back, black coffee in front of him, eyes scanning the door like he wasn't sure I'd actually come.
When he saw me, he stood up.
And for a moment, we just looked at each other. He hadn't changed much. A little more gray in his hair. The same tired softness behind his eyes. But it wasn't about appearances. It never was. It was about the way the air between us felt heavier than the room. The way time folded in on itself the moment I stood across from him. Lena, he said, his voice low. I nodded, sliding into the seat across from him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I broke the silence. I don't know why I'm here. Jonathan smiled, faintly. You do. I looked down at my hands. They were knotted in my lap, tense and pale. I told myself I could handle this, I whispered. That I could keep it contained. That it was harmless to hear from you again. His expression softened. And now, I feel like I opened a door I can't close. He nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. Me too. There was a silence then, long and dense, and full of everything we couldn't say out loud. I'm not here to wreck your life, he said. I swear, Lena, I never wanted that. I looked at him. I know. He reached across the table, slowly, cautiously. His fingers brushed mine.
Just barely.
A soft touch. Barely contact at all. And yet I felt it everywhere. You always said the right things, I murmured. He shook his head.
No.
I just never had the courage to say the real ones. Another pause. Then he whispered, Are you happy, Lena? I felt my throat tighten. And for the first time since this began, I didn't lie. I don't know. The rain outside began to fall harder, tapping urgently on the windows. Inside, we sat still, two people on opposite sides of a quiet confession, knowing that whatever came next would be a choice. And that nothing would ever feel innocent again. I didn't remember the drive home. I know I stopped at a red light. I know the rain made the streets shimmer like mirrors. But I couldn't tell you how I got from that cafe back to my house. My body drove. My mind stayed behind, with him. Jonathan hadn't kissed me. He hadn't even asked to. But something about the way he looked at me before I left, that quiet devastation in his eyes, felt more intimate than any touch could have been.
He wanted me.
Not in the casual, fleeting way I had grown used to over the years. Not the kind of wanting that fades after dinner and a goodnight kiss.
No. He wanted all of me.
even the parts one had buried.
And worse?
A part of me wanted to give it. When I walked through the front door, Greg was sitting at the kitchen table, his laptop open, but his eyes distant. He didn't look up. "You're late," he said. "I stopped to get groceries."
A lie.
Fast and easy. He closed the laptop gently, then looked at me. "I called you. Twice." My heart kicked once, hard. "I didn't hear it," I replied, too quickly.
He studied me.
"You're wearing perfume." I froze. I had sprayed some in the car. Just a little. Without thinking. A reflex. But now, standing in the quiet tension of our kitchen, it felt like a siren. "I felt gross after work," I said, deflecting. I needed to reset. Greg leaned back in his chair, eyes sharp but unreadable. "Lena," he said carefully, "are you seeing someone?" The words cut through the room like a knife. I blinked.
No.
Not a full lie. I hadn't done anything. But my pause was a fraction too long. And he saw it.
He didn't speak.
He just looked at me like he was trying to find something, anything that made sense. "I've been here," he said. "Every day. Showing up. Even when we were distant. Even when things felt off. I stayed." My throat tightened. "I know." He shook his head, slowly, painfully. "But you didn't." There was no shouting. No dramatics. Just the soft, quiet cracking of something that had taken years to build. I turned away. I couldn't look at him. Not when I didn't know who I was looking for anymore. That night, I lay awake in our bed while Greg slept downstairs on the couch. I stared at the ceiling and counted the seconds between each breath. In the dark, my phone lit up. "Jonathan, are you okay?" I stared at the screen for a long time, then typed,
No.
"Everything's coming undone." His reply came instantly. "Then let it. You deserve to stop pretending." I clutched the phone to my chest. And for the first time in years, I cried. Not because I was guilty. Not because I had been caught. But because someone had finally said it out loud. That maybe I didn't want to go back. Maybe I wasn't supposed to.